Want to welcome you to the Athenaeum of Ohio, Mount St. Mary's Seminary. My name is Father Benedicto Kinsella. I'm the rector of the seminary and the president of the Athenaeum. Father David Andrus, our dean, will introduce our guest speaker, but I wanted to take a moment to welcome you all and to thank you for coming for our lecture tonight. Our lecture, as well as being a lecture that we put on every year, it's also part of a course that we're running at the moment on religion and science. And so we're very excited to have Brother Guy here with us today. He is a man that spends 4 months of the year in the United States, and we just happened to catch him at the right time for our course and the right time for him being here, and obviously the right time for all of you. When he's not here in the United States, he lives in the Pope's house in Rome. So, he lives at Castel Gandolfo with the Holy Father, so that's as close as you can get, right? So without having the Pope here himself, this is as close as we get. One of us is infallible. Yeah. Yes. So, but we're very happy to have you here with us, brother. And Father David will do the academic introduction. I wanted to name this talk Brother Guy, the Man from the Sky, but that was nixed, okay? That was nixed. That's not the name of it. And then, but I thought that was a great name, right? Brother Guy, the Man from the Sky. Then it was, I think it was Religious Life of Techies was the name. But God's Mechanics, I suppose that's a good academic name to have. So once again, thank you for being here. We have a great crowd, and we're really looking forward to hearing brothers talk. So I'll introduce Father Andrus, our dean. Thank you.
Certainly, it's a great joy this evening to introduce Brother Guy Consolmagno, who is a native of Detroit, and so not so far away from us here. He earned undergraduate and master's degrees from MIT and a PhD in planetary science from the University of Arizona. He was a postdoctoral research fellow at Harvard and also MIT in the days before he entered the Society of Jesus, which he did in 1989. He has worked at the Vatican Observatory since 1993 and is currently serving actually as the director of the observatory. At the observatory, his research has explored connections between meteorites and asteroids and the evolution of small solar system bodies. I don't know too much about that, but I'm sure he will enlighten us this evening. Along with more than 200 scientific publications, he is also the author of a number of popular books that try to bridge faith and science in a particular way. One of his books, I thought was a great title, Brother Astronomer, Adventures of a Vatican Scientist, and then I think his most recent work, Would You Baptize an Extraterrestrial? So Brother Guy's lecture is being made possible tonight by a grant from the John Templeton Foundation. And as Father Ben mentioned, we do have a class that is meeting right now this semester, which is called Only Wonder Comprehends, which is also part of the Engaging Science in Seminaries grant from the Templeton Foundation. Tonight's lecture, in addition to being a public lecture, is also a fulfillment of part of that course. Tonight's lecture, and actually Father Ben was correct, and Brother Guy also, it's a two-part titled lecture, God's Mechanics, the Religious Life of Techies. Welcome, Brother Guy. Thank you for joining us this evening. We very much look forward to it.
Thank you very much. Thanks. So, thank you all for coming. I was expecting to talk to a group of about 30 or 40 seminarians. And so I'm glad to see there are so many seminarians here, all of you. In one sense, the title is a cheat because it's really the title of a book that this is all based on. Of course, the book is out of print, so why I'm bothering to push it is another question. I guess you can get the electronic version. The title of the book is God's Mechanics, and when we were looking for a cover, I came across this old issue of a popular mechanic. we all grew up, reading Popular Mechanics and, flying cars and all the marvelous things. And so I thought, you could take Popular Mechanics and change the title to God's Mechanics, and that device almost looks like a monstrance there. You can. Unfortunately, they couldn't find the rights to it, and this is the title that they finally came up with. Before I go into the whole point of the talk, which is how does religion look to somebody who's a scientist or an engineer? And this is really aimed at the people who are going to be preaching religion to a congregation full of scientists and engineers. How many people in this room would consider themselves techies of some sort? Yeah, there are a heck of a lot of you. I was talking to a bunch of people who do research in Washington, D.C. on religion and society. They point out that in a typical Catholic church, the congregation in the church is likely to be better educated than the general public, and for that reason, likely to have a larger than typical number of scientists, engineers, medical doctors, people who are techies. This is a thing to remember because you don't get a whole lot of technical education in the seminary. Before I do any of that, however, what I'd like to do is to start with a little film clip that I have about the Vatican Observatory. Everybody has these questions. You're from the Vatican Observatory. I didn't know the Vatican had an observatory. My job for 20 years has been to tell people the Vatican has an observatory. So everybody who tells me they didn't know is a sign of failure on my part. Thanks. So I've got a little film clip, and the sound is, I'm hoping, going to come from here. Let's see if we can get it to work. The film is narrated by someone who can do a much better job than I could in explaining the observatory.
Both science and religion are conversations about the universe. They're ways of learning how we interact with this universe. It's not simply a question of, is there a God, but there is a God, now what do we do? It's not just a question of, there are a bunch of stars, but rather, why are there stars? How do they work? How does that tell us how things work here on Earth? The interaction that I see in my own life is that religion gives me the reason to do the science.
Back in the papacy before Francis was Benedict, and one of his lines in a final elocution to the fathers of the general congregation was, "Go to the frontiers." Well, there isn't much more frontier than 3.7 billion years away.
The first official interest of the Church for astronomy started in 1582 with the reform of the calendar. Then in 1891, Pope Leo XIII wanted to have an observatory to show that the Church is not against science, but the Church promotes good science.
They start out by having telescopes on the Tower of the Winds, and then on the walls surrounding the Vatican, as the city lights grow, and as the Italian government gives them back the territory out in Castel Gandolfo. In the 30s, they build new telescopes on the roof of the Papal Palace in Castel Gandolfo, best telescopes of their era in the 1930s. By the 1980s, light pollution makes those telescopes unusable, so we build a new telescope in the dark skies of Arizona.
I'm Father Jean-Baptiste Kikwaya Eluo. I'm working in 3 projects. The first one is NEOS, Near Earth Object. So what I'm doing with NEOS is just observe them using our modern telescope VAT. The second project is meteors. I worked on very faint meteors, what we call shooting stars. And the third project is set fireball network. They will have 4 cameras here around Tucson so that actually we can monitor any fireball getting into the Earth atmosphere in the region.
This
telescope, the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope. It was the first of the new technology telescopes that has been considered pretty much the norm now in developing telescopes. With the advance of computer technology, we have the capability of bringing that advanced technology directly into our telescope. So it's an expandable, it's almost like it's a living machine, so it can grow as technology grows.
It is still very important to maintain scientific research at the Vatican, simply because there is still a lot of confusion about this relationship between science and faith. We are not out here trying to prove the existence of God by looking through a telescope. That's not what we're doing. But we can say that if we want to obtain any reasonable results looking through that telescope, we need to do it embracing a certain work ethics that is, in fact, the same work ethics that the Bible itself tells us through commandments and through the Gospels to embrace.
Human beings look at the stars and wonder. They want to know, what is that? What is that about? How do I fit in? They hear about the moon landing and they want to know, what was that like?
Very well.
If we're part of the human race, we're part of the race that went to the moon. We're part of the species that looked at the stars and wondered, what the heck are those things? Looking at the sky reminds you that there's more to the universe than what's for lunch. What's more, if you believe in a universe that God so loved that he sent his son, then not only are you going to want to study the universe because it's kind of cool, it's an act of worship. It's an act of getting closer to the Creator and getting closer to a universe, as St. Athanasius said 1,500 years ago, was cleansed and quickened by the Incarnation. Then, doing science is an act of worship.
So, this topic that I want to address today began at a science fiction convention. Science fiction drove an awful lot of my life. I went to MIT as a student because I had discovered that MIT had the largest collection of science fiction in the world, and I wanted a place to read it. And I studied planets because planets are places where people have adventures. So I'm a huge science fiction fan. This particular thought train got started at a science fiction convention in Chicago, about 10 years ago. And it was after a very long, fun, but kind of exhausting day that an old friend of mine from my MIT days came up along with her husband. And the two of them asked me this surprising question. They said, "Can you explain to us how this religion stuff works in your life?" Now, they knew that a person like me, who is a Jesuit brother and an astronomer, could exist because I do exist. But they wanted to know, in a practical way, how do you make it work? How does it all function together? And the reason they wanted to know, the reason they're interested in religion was, in a way that they never were when they were just young punk engineers learning it all at MIT, is that they had kids. They're getting older. They're raising a family. They're asking me because, along with being a Jesuit and a friend of theirs, I'm also, like them, a techie. And that got me wondering, what's been my experience of how techies look at religion compared to the way that non-techies do? So, what's a techie? This is my friend Bill Higgins. He kind of exemplifies to me what a techie is. A little overweight, really bright, full of a lot of fun. A techie is someone who makes his living as an engineer or a scientist, but it's someone more than that. Someone whose orientation to the world is pragmatic, logical, functional. A philosopher might ask, is it true? An artist might ask, is it beautiful? A techie is going to ask, how does it work? Techies see the work in terms of processes to be understood, jobs to be done, problems to be solved. Okay, there are these never-ending debates between science and religion. We're sick of them. A simple fact is forgotten, that an awful lot of scientists and engineers also happen to be churchgoers. My friend Bill Higgins, Golden Domer, graduate of Notre Dame, member of the Knights of Columbus, along with being a scientist at Fermilab. Even non-church-going techies are living in a culture that's saturated with religion, and they're fascinated by it. A few years ago, I was invited to come and lead a Bible study group, and I'm thinking, I'm a Catholic. Catholics don't do Bible study, right? A Bible study group in Houston. Oh, really? Not in Texas. No. A Bible study group in Texas for a bunch of astronauts. You go, oh, yeah, I could do that. Yeah. Actually, it turns out about half the group in the Bible study group were Catholics. But there's this one guy, this one astronaut, who was not a Catholic. And, he was very friendly, but he just wanted to volunteer right up front. He goes, I'm a strict Seventh-day creationist, he says. I'm solid in my belief that the world was made exactly word for the word the way it's described in Genesis. And I was wondering, which chapter of Genesis? Because there's two totally different stories that don't even agree with each other. What's more, have you actually read Genesis? It says the world is flat and there is a dome separating the waters above and below. Where does the shuttle go? Where is the space station? How come it doesn't get wet? Then he told me that before he'd been an astronaut, he had another job. He was actually a test pilot. And then I began to understand a little more where he's coming from. You don't want a test pilot who's in the habit of creatively interpreting the instructions he's given. A lot of techies are in that position, For a lot of occupations, a lot of techie occupations, a rigid literalism is part of the job description. Have you ever seen a priest who used to be an engineer? And the way they say Mass, it's like, oh my gosh, they follow the rubrics because if you drop a semicolon, the Mass won't compile. That's great, it's a wonderful way to be if you're writing in C. But don't go to the Museum of Modern Art with these people. They just get very confused. However, there's a bigger issue underlying this literal mindset. There is, I'm afraid, a serious misfit between the typical techie and the typical parish. Think of it. 100 years ago, in the Catholic Church, most of the people attending the church were immigrants, day laborers, factory workers, and a lot of our theology and a lot of our buildings were built with these people in mind. And that's not true anymore. The economy of the world is dominated by high tech. It's computers, it's information processing, a lot of different fields of engineering. And thanks to all these Jesuit universities out there, a lot of those laborers sent their kids and their grandkids to get white-collar jobs. And so a lot of, the children and grandchildren of Polish and Italian immigrants, people like me, are no longer blue-collar workers. Is there any evidence that our church is responding to the need of modern working techies? I'm reminded of this cartoon. If you can't read it, it's a group learning how to meditate. And the leader of the meditation group says, so in your mind's browser, clear your cache, delete your history, and navigate to a blank page. Geek meditation sessions. I remember when I was a Jesuit, and there was a lot of people who were trying to develop my affective side, the part that speaks to my heart, the part that speaks to my innermost desires. That's pretty hard for anybody to do. But when you're talking to a techie who have no idea what the word affective means. They think it means affected. That kind of preaching just sounds like gibberish. I remember one techie friend of mine was going through RCIA, and he was hearing all about, how God loves him, and that's great, but he kept saying, where do I learn the rules? That's what it's all about, right? Following the rules. When are they going to teach me the rules? About 10 years ago, I spent 6 weeks in as part of the program the Jesuits do called tertianship, where you pull yourself out of whatever you're doing and you renew your education before final vows. And generally what they do is they take, university professors who are priests and put them to a parish. Well, I'm not a priest, I'm a brother. What do you do with them? They put me at Santa Clara University, Silicon Valley, and I spent 6 weeks going up and down Route 101 talking to techies. And I started with friends of mine, and then people they recommended, and then people they recommended, and friends of friends of friends. And over that period of time, I must have talked to well over 100 techies. And I want to show a few of the things. In the book, I came up with 26 examples, and I named them lettered from A to Z. So you'll get an idea of where they were in the conversation. Alan and Beth, the first ones I talk about in the book. An astronomer, medical doctor. They live in this shambling 100-year-old house in Oakland. There's this explosion of toys and books, some of which belong to their kids. And they're church shopping because, just like my friends from MIT, the kids are young, and they're facing the issue of choosing a religion for their family. And it's really the needs and the desires of the kids that's driving all of this. So Alan was raised a Unitarian, Beth was raised a Catholic. Neither of them had been following that religion. So I'm asking them, what are the product features you look for when you're shopping for a religion? For Alan, it's the intellectual content of the religion. For Beth, she says, yeah, that's important, but you're also looking for an emotional content, chants and drums, something like that. And it's clear, though they each pull out these things, that Beth would be repelled by really bad theology and Alan by really bad liturgies. Beth is looking for a sense of mystery, which she doesn't find in the Unitarians. Alan was raised a Unitarian, thinks, yeah, they were kind of sterile. But on the other hand, they tried being a Quaker for a while, and they decided, the Northern California Quakers are just a little bit too flaky for them. But when I talk further, especially with Alan, I get the impression his desire for an intellectual foundation to the religion, the core beliefs, actually for him are not things to be believed, as long as they are things that he knows he doesn't have to not believe. He doesn't think he can find truth. He just wants to make sure that he's not going to buy into a religion that's already obviously wrong. Okay, of all the religions out there, which ones does he think is obviously wrong? Northern California. Any guesses which religions that he names as being obviously wrong? There are two of them that come up. No? They're happy. He's happy to handle Baptists. That's no problem with that. Scientology, number one. Which is fun because they claim to be scientific, but no scientist would have anything to do with them. What's the other one? Especially knowing this is California, this is the West. Mormons. Every group I've asked has named those two. And it's interesting because I actually know a number of Mormons who are techies. My thesis advisor at MIT was a Mormon. And they'll admit that their religion looks strange to the outside, but it has an internal logic that they're happy with. As long as he can give himself a possibility of believing, that's good enough. Which is not kind of the way that most of us think about looking for truth in religion. But it's the way he's looking for truth in religion. So you dig a little bit further and you realize the features you go looking for when you're shopping for a religion depend on the function that the religion is going to perform for you. If it's going to bring you closer to God, then that's the deeper question, why would you believe in God? And I don't mean what is the proof that God exists, but rather, what's the rationale for bothering to care if God exists or not in the first place? For some people, some techies, believing in God is useful because it gives them an answer to the famous Leibniz question, why is there something instead of nothing? Here is this universe. There's no obvious reason within the universe itself to explain why the universe exists. In fact, there can't be. Wittgenstein pointed that out. Think of the chair that you're sitting in. That chair has a function. But it has a function only because there's something that's not chair that's using the chair. The chair doesn't have its meaning in and of itself. The universe cannot have its meaning in and of itself. Therefore, there must be something outside the universe, or it's meaningless. And you pay your money, you take your choice. For other people, the utility of believing in God is it gives them a way of orienting themselves. Who am I? What's the coordinate system? How can I tell if I'm making progress? And to some, it's just this response to those inner longings that you have in 3 a.m. when you're lying in bed. And you know that I'm longing for the transcendent. And God is found either in that thing that I'm longing for and or the fact that I have the longings. And those of you who have studied theology will recognize that it's straight out of Rahner, the Wovorhin and the Wofür, and it's crazy German theology. But it describes not why people believe, in which we would say because they're approved, but why people care to believe. Another couple, Carol and David. They're both scientists at the NASA Ames Research Center, and I'm sitting in their home. It's in Mountain View. It's a Wednesday evening. They're older than Alan and Beth. Their home is a little more sparsely furnished. They have pictures on the mantle of his adult kids and her adult kids. Carol describes herself as a liberal Methodist, and David doesn't believe. Carol says that she uses belief as a way of orienting and structuring her life. She says, believing in God makes me a better person. That's why I believe, which sounds, very functional. But to both of them, the most compelling reason for believing is that internal urge that makes them look for the transcendent. Even David, who claims to be an atheist, says that he can be moved in uncomfortable ways when he's going to church at Christmas time with Carol. But nonetheless, he's still an atheist, and he explained it this way. He says, I was raised a Presbyterian, and in my early 20s, I was going to the Presbyterian church, and I was active in the young adult group, and the minister brings in this rabbi to talk about Judaism, and this Catholic priest to talk about Catholicism, and the rabbi was really good, and the Catholic priest was really good, and our minister was really good. But I realized they can't all be true, so they must all be false. Now, when I tell this to most non-techies, you see the obvious fallacy immediately, but when you're a scientist, it almost makes sense. Because when you're trying to figure out what's going on in the world and you turn a knob and nothing happens, you say, all right, that knob has no importance to the system. Of course, what if they had brought in a Scientologist or a Mormon? Maybe he would have been able to say, I guess there are some obvious differences. Another description, the techie mindset. I was talking to a professor who is a Russian Orthodox, and he's teaching a course in one of the universities for engineers about using religion as an example of the mathematical theory of chaos. To him, different religions are different series approximations to the truth. Anybody here know enough tech to know what a series approximation is? You'll follow the logic. He says, some religions converge on the truth faster than others. Some religions get close and then they diverge. And if you know what he's saying, you go, yeah, that's a techie way of trying to describe. And if you don't know what they're saying, you realize, I have no idea what he's talking about. That makes no sense at all, but it makes great sense to him. One of the guys I talked to, I wanted to give him the name Justin, and he says, no, I don't sing in a boy band. Call me Jules. This guy, actually, I'll tell you his real name. He gave me permission to do it. He's a Caltech grad, and he goes by the name Katine. He's a Caltech grad who makes his living as a professional photographer. So he's got this balance between the artistic and the techie. I remember I visited him at his room in his house in South San Francisco, and he opens a cabinet, and there are 20 unlabeled jars of little flakes. And he says, which kind of tea would you like? And he knows all of them, and he can sniff, and I assume they're all teas. I didn't ask. But this is what the guy looks like. That's one of his photographs. You can see he's quite a photographer. And you can see that he's straight out of the 60s, except the hair is gray and the shirt is a little bit wider than it used to be. And we sit down, and in our marvelous techie way, Caltech and MIT, we start listing the question that comes up over and over again among techies. If religion is true, how come there's so many of them? And how do you choose which is the right one? So, well, number one, they can't all be right, so they must all be wrong. That was, my friend David's answer. Number two, they are all correct. They're just different descriptions of the same thing. All churches must be the same, because at the end of the day, they all tell you to do the same thing, and function equals content, if you're a techie. I had a friend who was one of the people I talked to, was a Seventh-day Adventist. And how did he come to that? Well, he was raised a Catholic, and he left the Catholic Church because it had too many rules. And then he married a Seventh-day Adventist and joined her church. Talk about too many rules. Never mind. Just rules as content. That's the way they think. Number three, different religions are kind of like different computer operating systems. And the one that's right for you depends on which platform you are. You can't run a Mac operating system on a PC. So, the choice of which religion you follow depends on your personal history, your internal needs, your genetics, the general question of why you're trying to get out of the religion. And it's not the same as number two that says all religions are equally good, because there will be one religion that will be better for you and a different religion that might be better for you. And, like computer systems, some religions have more features than others, but the more features you have, the more likely you are to run into bugs. That's, my friends, Alan and Beth, kind of were looking at religions like they were trying to choose a computer system. Different religions are different approximations of the truth, and some get closer to the truth than others, like the series approximation. It does suggest that one religion would be better than another in the long run, though not necessarily truer than the other. And then number five. There are different kinds of physics. Aristotle had a way of describing the universe that worked in a kind of rough and ready way until we found out the places where it doesn't work. And Newton came along and fixed the things that Aristotle got wrong, and that seemed to work until we discovered the places where Newton's physics don't work. And now we've got quantum physics, and every one of these is, each of you can reduce quantum physics to Newtonian physics with the right approximation, but quantum physics has more details and gives you truth in places where the other ones won't. And so the one true religion is the one that actually is the most complete. And I have to confess, that's kind of where I am. As a Catholic, I find, for all of the overhead, and Catholic Church has a big overhead, I'm reminded of people ask me, working at the Vatican Observatory, being an astronomer at the Vatican, how can I deal with the fact that I have to deal every day with an enormous bureaucracy run by people who seem to be idiots and get in their way and do more harm than good and drive you nuts? And I say, yeah, but NASA was the only outfit that could get us to the moon. That's my take on it, but other techies have other takes on it. I've talked to a lot of people during this time. Students, professors, young Turks, senior executives, theoretical physicists, engineers. Lots of differences, but I begin to find a common pattern in the interviews. So, the typical techie, growing up, has serious questions about truth by the time they get to college. A lot of them abandon organized religion at that time, but they never abandon the desire to find God. And then they get married, start a family, start going to the wife's church. It's usually the wife who wins. Not always, but usually. And regardless of which one's the techie in the family. By the time they're 40, they're going to church again, but they still have not lost their skepticism about some of the problems of organized religion, the things that bothered them when they were 20. It's just that they're no longer thinking about looking for truth, they're looking for ways of communicating important things to their families. The kids, as they're being raised, then reach a point where they become skeptical about organized religion and they go to college and they're going to be rebellious until they grow up themselves and be starting a family and then wind up in an organized church again. But that period when you're in college is a period where you try to deal with questions of self-identity and you try to define your own value of your own ideas of value and truth. There's another thing that I noticed talking to techies. And this is directed to the seminarians here and the people who are going to be writing homilies. An awful lot of people, oh yeah, I like to go to church. I love the homilies. It's like white noise, so I don't have to think about anything and I can pray. Think of that as all the work you do. There is a real pattern, I would almost say temptation. When you're the preacher, you don't want to be up there, lording it over your congregation because most of the people in the congregation have an education that in many ways is equal to yours. And the temptation is to say, we're all in this together, we're all sinners together, we're all on a journey to God. It's this pilgrimage to, the image of the pilgrim church that came out of Vatican II. Great, except you talk to a techie who's, this is word for word, looking at the priest up there, and he goes, why should I listen to some guy in a purple dress who doesn't even know how to make the microphone work? I'm reminded of the story of the centurion. A techie identifies himself or herself as someone with expertise. I know how to make a better widget than anyone else in the world. You want widgets, you come to me. I know what expertise is. If you're going to be teaching me about something about science and God or something about religion and truth or morality, show me that you know what you're talking about more than I do. Because like the centurion, you can say, I tell an electron go when it goes, and I tell an electron come when it comes. And yet, it's very hard for a lot of preachers to be able to get up there and say, you know what, I spent a few years studying this stuff. This is what I know. I mentioned this at another seminary, and the rector gets up and turned to the seminary and says, make sure you actually study so you can have something you can tell these people. I ran into another thing of, I'm living in Rome. I get my scientist friends visiting all the time. One of them, we of course, you're going to be in Rome, you're going to take a tour of St. Peter's. So, one of them sees these posters on the wall that has the list of all the popes. Going back, there was a 265 or something like that. And he was stunned. He goes, you actually know the names of every pope, going back to, it's the mean value theorem. There was a pope now, there was a pope then, there was probably a chain. They had never thought of that before. When was the last time you heard anybody talk about apostolic succession? That's something that carries weight to a techie. It embarrasses your, Episcopalian friends, but it carries weight to a techie. Another one, just walking through St. Peter's. I assume a bunch of you probably have been to St. Peter's, you've been to Rome, and there's a route you take that goes. The first thing you see, a friend of mine was taking his parents, and his mom looks up and she says, "Oh, how nice, they've got the copy of the Pietà here." No, it's not a copy. So I'm taking my friend through, and he's looking at all the different things. And St. Peter's is a heck of a church. It's an amazing building. It's often embarrassing to a lot of Americans because, oh my gosh, it's ostentatious and heaven forbid. And my friend is looking at it, and he gets this really weird look in his face. And he finally turns to me about halfway around St. Peter's, and he goes, "The people who built this, they really believed this." And I go, "Well, yeah, I really believe it. But it hit him in a way, the grandeur of the church, literally and figuratively. The history of the church was something, the theology, the 2,000 years of theology that has survived several changes in our scientific cosmology, and not only survived, but come out stronger than ever. That's powerful to a techie, and not something you hear people talk about. My friend actually went home and joined a Protestant church and is, pillar of the church there now. The power of the immensity of St. Peter's, like the power of apostolic succession, is tied to the idea of authority. Ministers who don't assert their expertise not only don't give the techie any reason to listen to them, they also implicitly are saying to the techie, your expertise doesn't matter. The very thing that you use to define yourself doesn't matter. They don't want to hear that, and rightly so. We have expertise. You notice the guy with the familiar collar there, Georges Lemaitre. He was a fellow with 2 degrees, one from MIT in astrophysics, one from Louvain in mathematics. He was the kind of guy who could read equations the way that you and I might be able to read a poem. He read the equations of Einstein's general relativity, and he said, you know what this means? The universe is not static, it's expanding. And if it's expanding, then there was a time when it was a lot smaller and denser and more energetic, and there was probably a 0 point if you can figure out how fast it's expanding. And a lot of other scientists in his time were horrified at this idea. Fred Hoyle, who was, a vicious anti-cleric, made fun of it on the BBC by referring to Father Lemaitre's Big Bang theory. That's where the name came from. The Big Bang was invented by a Catholic priest. We've got people who can speak with authority. Fred Hoyle and Father Lemaitre finally met face to face at a meeting at the Vatican in the 1950s, and they became best of friends because they're both interested in the same universe. And both of them knew that both of them might be wrong. When Pope Pius XII was making noises like he wanted to endorse the Big Bang theory, Father Lemaitre went to him and said, don't do that. I could be wrong. 1,000 years from now, we may have a completely different idea of the formation of the universe. What's more, when we say that God created out of nothing, creation didn't occur 13.8 billion years ago. What do we know about God? In the beginning, God created. In the beginning, God's already there. God is not part of the universe. God is supernatural. God is outside of space and time, and therefore the creative act is not fixed to one place or one time, but it is every place and every time. God creates not only 13.8 billion years ago, but right now. And now. And now. And now. Now there's an interesting sidebar from Stephen Hawking. Wrote this book where he claims, I've solved the problem of creation out of nothing. If there's a vacuum, There's still a zero-point energy, and the laws of physics say that that zero-point energy can have quantum fluctuations, and one of those fluctuations could be big enough to give rise to a Big Bang. And therefore, I don't need God to start the Big Bang. Gravity did it. The fluctuations of the primordial gravity field. Now, number one, if you've got a primordial gravity field and laws of physics, you've already got something, not nothing. And number two, if you're saying that my definition of God is the thing that started the Big Bang, and gravity is the thing that started the Big Bang, you're not saying there is no God, you're saying that God is gravity, which I don't think he really wanted to say. Of course, if God is gravity, that would explain why Catholics celebrate Mass. Talking about religion and extremes of religion and having, fundamentalism of science or fundamentalism. I talked to another religious fanatic. This guy works at Apple Computers. And he's in his office at, number 1 Infinite Loop. He's no stranger to evangelical sales pitches. He's no stranger to the power of a centralized authority. And we get talking to what religion is all about to him. And he goes, I'm talking to all these people who are looking at religion for some functional thing. What can it do for my family? What can it do for me at 3 in the morning when I'm feeling weird? And he goes, you got to remember, people already have an idea of truth. By the time you're finished with college, you're pretty convinced of what truth is and what truth isn't. In a religion, you're not selling truth. You're selling tech support. Once a week scheduled maintenance to keep your truth up to date. So the priest or the rabbi is someone you call in when things are broken? Is that really what's going on? Still thinking of calling people in to fix things. Doing this study, I'm an amateur ethnologist, really, is what I'm doing. And I've got no training in this, so I finally talked to a professional ethnologist, a fellow named Dr. Julian Orr. And writing his thesis at Cornell, he got a job, got support from the Xerox Corporation, who wanted him to study the dynamics of what goes on in offices so they can make better machinery that works in offices the way that people actually function. And he gets the bright idea, if you're going to be an ethnologist, if you're going to be, someone who works out, and he disguises himself as a Xerox copier repairman. He goes to Xerox copier repair school, gets hired on, he lives with them, he goes to Denny's with them, he's sitting around the table waiting for the buzzer to go off that they're called to fix a computer someplace, or a Xerox machine someplace. And what he finds is that Xerox, in its infinite wisdom, gives every repairman a big manual of, error number 1, error number 2, error number 3, and the computer, the Xerox copiers will report error number 1, error number 2, and you look up in the manual and you figure out from the manual this is how you solve error number 12 or whatever. Except Xerox copiers never break the way that they think they're going to in the home office. There's nothing there for what happens when somebody puts a bologna sandwich in the paper feed. Which apparently has happened. So what happens is the copier repairmen sitting around Denny's drinking coffee, waiting for their buzzers to go off, their pagers to go off, swap stories. There is this oral tradition among Xerox copier repairmen about how to fix machines when they break in ways that nobody expects. And one of the things they do is they take the rule book and back engineer, if that's what they're saying you have to do to fix the machine, then I guess this is how the machine must work. Because Xerox thinks the machine's too complicated for anybody to understand. Here's just the rules. But that's really not good enough for them. They want to know how the machine works, and if you won't tell them, they'll figure it out for themselves. Not always getting it right. And then with this homemade understanding, they start passing rules among themselves. And it hits me, that's how a lot of techies deal with religion. They think religion is a big book of manuals of right and wrong, And if they think about it, they'll say, okay, here's what's really going on. Here's what's really important. And they back engineer a theology based on the rules that they've learned as kids or the rules that they've heard at the pulpit. And they agree with the general, goals that the Xerox Corporation has. You should make the machines work. They have great contempt for the suits at Xerox who don't really know what the real world is like. And they, don't bother reading the documentation because it doesn't really affect how the world actually works. But they know that just following a cookbook is not the same thing as understanding how food works. Just following a cookbook is not the same thing as understanding how the machine works. I wrote all of this 10 years ago, and the arguments and the debates about the most recent stuff out of Rome on how to deal pastorally with people who have managed to screw up their lives by not following the rules. How do you get them back on the track? I find echoes of the same issues. Life is more complicated than the rules. Sometimes you've put a bologna sandwich in your paper feed. There's another side of these conversations that impresses me. It's the commitment that all the people I've talked to have given to their various faiths. We only have so many hours in the day. And we try to multitask so that, if you're playing a game, you're also thinking about religion. There's an awful lot of right and wrong that comes up in role-playing games. There's an awful lot of questions of right and wrong that comes up in reading fantasy. The moments when we contemplate the big questions in life might be when you're playing a role-playing game, might be when you're listening to some atmospheric music, might be when you're reading science fiction. There's a heck of a lot of theology in Star Wars. Not always good theology, but often good theology. That's, the Techies version of meditation, prayer. Meditation and prayer, of course, that's spirituality. That's not the same thing as religion. And to a lot of people, it sounds like they're choosing religion the way that you would choose Peet's coffee versus Starbucks coffee. I think for people who are actually not in religions, that's what choosing a religion looks like. I remember I was thinking of joining the Jesuits. I showed all the literature of the Jesuits to a friend of mine who's active in the local Society for Creative Anachronism, medieval role-playing group. And she goes, boy, this stuff looks really cool. Except for all the God stuff. This would be really cool junk. But reading over my interviews again, I realize that the unspoken bit is, if you're a techie who belongs to a church, it's more than lifestyles, it's more than communities, it's different from belonging to a bowling league. When you go to a church, it is precisely for the God stuff. It's just that they have a great reticence about talking about it. They don't want to talk about it even to a trusted friend, even to a family member, even to themselves. And yet, in all the different techies I asked, believers and not believers, and I had asked these questions about belief, there's not one of them who said, what are you talking about? Every one of them has asked these questions, maybe come up with different answers, but they've all asked these questions. They knew what I was getting at. I wasn't raising anything they hadn't already thought of for themselves. I remember a sort of insight that I had. My friend Carol, who said she was a Methodist, she belongs to church because it makes her life better. It wasn't a functional thing. It was, there must be some truth content to it because it works. It works because it makes my life better. Oh, I can go along with that. There's one more wrinkle. In today's world, technology, being able to deal with technology, is not only a lifestyle choice or a job, it's a social justice issue. Curiosity about the world is a basic human trait. If you deny somebody the chance to wonder about the world, you're denying them their humanity. The ability to understand the world in a scientific sense gives you power. It empowers you. It provides you with a habit of mind that allows you to see problems as things that can be solved. When you look at the world in terms of cause and effect, then you can begin to understand, why am I in this? It's not just that, stuff happens and poor little me, I'll always be. No, wait a minute. Here is a problem I can solve. Here is a way that I can make the world a better place, make my world a better place, support my family in a better way. This is what comes out of the mechanical techie worldview. The ability to analyze problems and recognize things that can be solved. Okay, the mechanical world is incomplete. Every worldview is incomplete. But if you don't have that as one of your worldviews, where are you going to get the courage to be able to attack problems like poverty, disease, social injustice? Okay, a lot of techies are not all that effective, not all that in touch with their feelings, or at least they don't have the vocabulary to describe their feelings. But you guys are in the business of meeting people where they are. Figure out where they are. Figure out a way that you can bring them to where they want to be. If nothing else, figure out how to make the microphone work. Remember, Jesus himself was a techie. Okay, he was male, single, and smarter than everybody around him. More than that. Okay, and when he tried to fix the world, he got crucified. That happens to techies too. The word technology comes from the Greek techne, which the ancients represented as the mere mechanical functioning, which was not nearly as cool as being a philosopher. So you can imagine when Jesus the carpenter shows up and starts lecturing to the priests, that would be like a plumber showing up at a philosopher's convention. Who the heck is this guy? And, they say this in the gospel, but we sometimes don't give it the right tone of voice. What they're saying is, who does he think he is? Where is this stuff coming from? My fellow techies feel just as alienated at times. But they have a way of working with the universe that has a lot that the rest of us can learn from. And they believe. They may be mechanics, rude mechanics, but they're God's mechanics. And I'll mention my friends 10 years ago, okay, actually the dad wound up becoming an elder in the Episcopal church that he was raised in. The kids wound up singing in the choir. The kids are now graduated, one from Worcester Polytech, the other from MIT. And I know the older one at least has become, something of an atheist, that he's 20 years old. That happens when you're 20. Wait till he starts a family. The whole pattern will start over again. Thanks a bunch.
Thank you very much, Brother Guy. We do have a little bit of time for some Q&A, so I think that there are at least there's one or two microphones that are wireless that are going to be passed around.
The point of the microphone is that it's being recorded, so if you don't talk into the microphone, I'll know what you said, but whoever's watching it later won't know. So wait for the microphone to come.
So if anyone has a question, you can raise your hand and we'll get David to bring the microphone.
Raise it so that the people with the microphone can find you.
Okay, great.
Okay. Here comes somebody with a microphone. Raise it so they can find you. Stand up even. Who knows? Be bold. If you must sin, sin boldly. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I can't hear you. So it's got to be turned on?
Oh, it's on.
Oh, it's on. Okay.
Talk. I'm not sure. Okay. I'm curious if you have observed any generational differences in techies, and if so, could you comment?
Yes, absolutely, I see generational differences. The techies of the generation ahead of me, the old guys, were very much more likely to want to wave the atheist flag and say, look at me, I'm a serious scientist because I'm an atheist. And they were much more suspicious of the church, partly because I think the church at that time was much more suspicious of them. You know, there was a time when you're going to be a good Catholic. Why would you go to MIT? Why don't you go to a good Catholic school? They teach engineering too, don't they? Well, no, they don't. And I think, especially since the 70s, there's been, even my atheist friends say, Jesuit, that's really cool. And they ask me questions about it. My friends who are Orthodox Jews get lots of people, how do you make that work? Okay, I see the rules. How do you apply the rules? It's a fascination. And there's a much greater tolerance for people with different opinions in the younger generation than you find in the older generation. That's good, but what comes with it is often a sense that it kind of doesn't matter. And I think it actually does matter. So that's the difference that I see. There's another question up here. Do you still have the mic, or did they took it away?
It's right here.
Okay.
I know this one will be off the wall. Since you were involved in the universe and the stars and whatever, is Venus a young planet or an old planet?
Yeah, there was a guy named Velikovsky back in the 1950s who had a crackpot theory, and he was horrified when people complained that his crackpot theory was published without proper refereeing. It's interesting, you know, in order to get a paper published, you've got to convince a group of scientists that it's worth publishing. And his stuff can mostly be disproved 12 different ways before you even get to second base. Venus is, you know, we've got every reason to believe that Venus is 4.567 billion years old, just like all the meteorites, just like the Earth, just like the other planets. And there may be a difference of 1 to 5 million years in its age, but it's all old. And there's no reason not to believe that. Every generation has its own variety of crackpotism, and Velikovsky was the crackpot of the 50s. As someone said, you know, they laughed at Fulton and they laughed at Einstein, but they also laughed at Bozo the Clown.
What do you think about somebody like Neil Tyson deGrasse, who thinks as science pushes out, it'll take all mystery away, and what do you need God for then?
Yeah, Neil's actually a buddy of mine. I wrote this book, some of you know, Turn Left at Orion, and my co-author, Dan Davis, knew Neil Tyson back in high school. So, you know, it's one of these everybody knows everyone else. And Neil is somebody who's kind of the last hanger-on of that old generation who says, look at me, I'm a serious scientist. Partly, it's defensive because he spends most of his time doing science popularization rather than science. And there is a stigma attached to that. Oh, you're not a real scientist, you're just going out and giving public talks. Most scientists, you know, have nothing to do with Bill Nye. Most scientists, and these guys, the science popularizers, do important things. But too often, they become defensive about their bona fides and will want to overreact rather than being able to say, you know, everybody at MIT, when I was a student there to this day, everybody knows that they got in by mistake and everybody else there is smarter than they are. The difference is whether you care or not. And they care. So when Neil talks about science, he does a great job of talking about science. When he dips into history and philosophy, well, that's not his expertise. And part of the cost of being a popularizer is oftentimes, I think you're put in a box where the people who are paying your bills want you to say these things. The Cosmos series that he did has some dreadful bits in it. But I almost think that the producers said, we've got this really cool animation, of Giordano Bruno being burned at the stake. You got to include that. We paid for the animation. And, he's not, he's trapped in his own worldview. But then we're all, in some ways, trapped in our worldviews as well. It's tough because so many of the scientists you see on TV are the ones who are most insecure about their bona fides as scientists, which makes you wonder about most of the religious people you see on TV. The more of a fundamentalist you are, the more you're afraid that you really don't have the faith, and you cling to rules because that's the last thing you've got. Whereas a true person of faith has faith in their faith and isn't afraid to have it challenged. Rather, they want to have it challenged because it gets stronger. Other questions? There's a few more here, the people with the microphones. Yeah.
I have been an evolutionist since 1948 when I took a biology class right here on these grounds. Mm-hmm. And in my recent studies a few years back, they say that 44% of the very intelligent people of the United States are fundamentalists who believe in creationism. Now, what can we Catholics do to help them?
Well, what really happens in surveys like that is people don't hear the question you think you're asking. When you ask a question of that type, people are likely to hear rather, what tribe do you belong to? Are you, an East Coast liberal, or are you a solid Midwestern conservative? And they have this set of things that you're supposed to be. It's much like the guy who's, never thought much about religion, but I'm going to be a scientist, therefore I guess I have to be an atheist. What we have to do is to break down that kind of tribalism. What we have to do is to remind people that the people who you're most mad at and think are crazy have a lot of truth that they can teach you. And before I can convince this guy that he's got to change his ways, maybe I have to convince myself to listen to what they're afraid of. If fundamentalism comes out of fear, well, maybe the fear is illegitimate, even if the answer to the fear is wrong. If you don't address the fear, then you're left with people going back into the easy answer that they see on TV.
I had a question and then kind of a comment to piggyback off what the gentleman said over there. Well, my comment would be, I have an opinion about Bill 9 that, we have the Ark encounter right down the road. And I think what he does is to try to, I think he's really scared about the fact that nearly half, people polled, I guess, believe that the Earth really was created in 7 days, and that there's a whole generation of young people growing up who can go to that museum and tour and actually believe that and learn to think that science is the evil or the non-religious. So I think he's trying to, fight against that. But my question before that was, being in the Vatican, is there in medicine and technology that kind of the way they intersect, is there a point where, I guess in your circle, where people say, okay, this type of breakthrough, we've got to stop, it's coming too close to playing God, or something like that?
There's a really important difference. First of all, a difference between technology and science, but also a difference between whether something is possible and whether something's a good idea. Nobody that I know of disputes the way that a birth control pill works. The science we'll accept. The question is, what are the implications of it? And oftentimes, in a lot, especially of medical technology, there are unforeseen consequences that are worth raising the issues about and worth getting people to worry about. What is the problem with playing God? Well, there is a problem with playing God, and that is when you interfere with the dignity of the human being that you're playing the God on. And you never want to forget that. In a funny way, we've been lucky so far. The biggest example of the church fighting against a bad use of science was in the last century, when the church was one of the few groups fighting against eugenics. As it happens, eugenics was trash science. It doesn't work. Even if it did work, it would have been wrong. The idea that you can judge people and their worth on some linear scale, so that your genes are better than my genes, therefore you deserve to live and I don't deserve to live, is fundamentally wrong, even if there were a way that one could judge people by their genes. But in fact, there isn't, because human beings don't fit on a linear scale. There are issues that are really tricky and well worth debating about good treatments that come from inhumane. The Nazis did horrible experiments that turned into trash science. What if they had done clever experiments that gave us treatments for diseases by experimenting on the Jews? Do you use those? Do you not use those? How do you deal with that? I mean, the principle in law is, if the evidence is tainted, the way that you stop people from making more tainted evidence is you don't use it. You're not allowed to use it. It's a nasty issue with not a simple answer. But what has to be remembered is there's not a dispute about the science being right or wrong. There is a big dispute about, is this something that we as human beings want to do? And somebody's got to raise those issues. And frankly, okay, and the last question here. I'm running out of energy.
So I was going to ask if you had ever considered debating Ken Ham, but I feel that issue has already been addressed. So instead, I'm curious.
Nobody learns anything from debates. What happens is that each tribe shows up and they cheer their guy.
Right.
And they go home more convinced than ever that the other side is evil.
Right. Indeed. Well, I'm curious to know if the Vatican engages in other pursuits of scientific research beyond astronomy, like
the Vatican
geology,
is actually
physics.
a dinky outfit. The budget of the Vatican city-state, which is the part of the Vatican that pays for the observatory, is about 300 million euros a year. You can barely make a blockbuster movie with that much money. The Archdiocese of Cincinnati has a bigger budget and more employees. So the Vatican Observatory, in that sense, is merely a token. And by a happy accident, they chose to support the one kind of astronomy that's not going to compete with patents or money or, do anything practical that might be important. But the Vatican does have something called the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, which is 120 scientists, supposed to be the same as the number of cardinals, who are Nobel Prize winners and similar rank. You don't have to be Catholic, you don't have to be a believer. Stephen Hawking is a member. But every couple of years they have a plenary session where they raise the issues happening in science that they feel the church needs to be aware of. And the issues are all over the place, and they're not all left-wing and they're not all right-wing. The most recent group, there are two strong themes. One was that we have to worry about climate change and we need stronger government action to deal with climate change, and that a lot of the fight against genetically manipulated organisms is completely false, and the problem is we have too much government action. So, all right, we're supposed to have more government action and less government action. It's like many things, my friends on the left are really good at identifying problems and really terrible at coming up with solutions. So that's why we need people on the right to be engaged as well, please. And we need to talk to each other. But yeah, there is definitely an awareness of science, an embracing of science, and needless to say, Catholics working in every field of science in labs and universities around the world. Thanks a whole lot, everybody, for coming.